Good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones, and this is SP History. If you've been following my channel, you know it's dedicated to the JFK assassination. But as you proceed through the research, you discover that there were other events, other events in that time period that are related to the JFK assassination. And in fact, here recently, Donald Trump just released files under the JFK Assassination Records Release Act, or executive order, which didn't just release JFK assassination files, but they also released RFK assassination files, MLK assassination files. And so I decided to get into the MLK subject and the RFK subject as well, which we just recently concluded. And in doing so, it took me in a direction, especially when I got into the MLK research. I learned a lot about the civil rights movement that I did not previously know. It's almost embarrassing after 30 years of teaching history to high school students to acknowledge the fact there's a lot about Malcolm X, who is another victim of assassination during this, right smack in the middle of all this time period. You have JFK in 63. You have MLK and RFK both in 68, and right between those in 65, you got MLK. And what I was always taught and what I passed on to the students, what was in the textbook, was that MLK was an apostle of hate, hated white people. He was revenge-minded, vengeance-minded. He was sort of the beginning of the Black Power movement, and he was eventually killed by his own people. And so hate begot hate, so to speak. In other words, he got what was coming to him. That was what I knew of Malcolm X, that his own bodyguards, his own Nation of Islam brothers killed him. And because of the intramural rivalries between all the civil rights groups, jealousy, envy, political issues, things of that nature. But as I got into the MLK research, I discovered that they were saying a lot of the same things about MLK. There was a lot of, and a lot of it was coming from the FBI. It was coming from Washington, and they were pushing these buttons to try to provoke these divisions, try to manipulate and exploit, all that kind of stuff. And I thought, might it be that the same things I'm hearing about MLK are also true about Malcolm X? So I felt like it was necessary for me and for all of us really to truly understand what happened in the 60s in our country, to at least study the Malcolm X assassination and see if there was anything in common with what we had previously learned in MLK, RFK, JFK. I mean, after all, it did happen during the same period. So at least it begs the question. So this is going to be I tell you, I've learned a ton. I've been studying this now for the last few months, and I'm just blown away by what I've learned. And it's interesting, after you've done this time and time again, different with other research topics, and you reach the same conclusion every time, you start to notice the patterns and the trends. And when you start to see these players at work and another one, you realize this is another situation where a threat was perceived, and a decision was made about neutralizing that threat. And sometimes they use different tactics, different strategies to neutralize the threat, but it's the same people behind the same powers behind the throne pushing the buttons. And it's really eye-opening. It really helps you put into context and the time period and what happened. It also helps explain what is currently happening. What happened to, for example, to candidate Trump last summer, twice, some people say 3 times. And you realize it's always the same. It's somebody who is a threat to the establishment, somebody who, if allowed to continue, will become a bigger threat, possibly get their hands on the levers of power, and be an existential threat to those that are behind the scenes, this deep state that we like to talk about, these powerful institutions that have their own ideas about how power should be wielded, about policy, about what we should be doing as a country, what our priorities should be, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope you'll join me in this study of Malcolm X, and it'll probably be about 10 episodes. I'm going to try to keep them a little shorter because there's so much information that is, I think, new, and it hasn't been studied and publicized to the degree that JFK, RFK, even MLK has. So there's a lot of people. If I didn't know, after 30 years of teaching history, if I didn't know a lot of this, chances are many of you didn't either or don't. So this is going to be breaking a lot of new ground, a lot of new territory. And so I want to take it in bite-sized chunks. I don't want to be doing 2-hour episodes trying to cram too much information. It will overwhelm all of us. So I want to take it in bite-sized chunks and methodically work our way through that. When we reach the end of this, wrap it all up in an episode that compares and contrasts all the different similarities between or amongst the 4 victims of assassination in 1960. And of course, there were more than 4, but these are the most prominent. So anyway, let's begin. And I've titled this study, CoIntelpro Pushes the Right Button. If you followed through and watched any of my MLK episodes, you understand what CoIntelpro is. It's short for Counterintelligence Program. It was launched by J. Edgar Hoover out of the FBI to discredit organizations such as the anti-war movement, such as the civil rights organizations, and discredit their leaders, such as Martin Luther King, such as Malcolm X, such as Fred Hampton, on and on it goes, in the eyes of the American people, and create fear of these groups and these leaders so as to justify any federal response to them. And they have all kinds of tactics and strategies and means at their disposal. It's the federal government. They ally themselves with all sorts of organizations. By the way, the CIA was doing this at the same time. Their program called Operation Chaos. That was the whole story of Charles Manson trying to scare white America into the prospect of there being a race war. It's the same thing. It's the same operation, just the CIA did it. They called theirs Operation Chaos. And they were operating domestically, which is illegal. They weren't supposed to be doing it. The FBI was operating domestically, which is legal. But we didn't find out about any of this until the 70s when the church hearings exposed all this. And there was a burglary actually on the FBI side. The church hearings exposed Operation Chaos and MK Ultra and all that kind of stuff on the CIA side. On the FBI side, there was a burglary and of an FBI station, and a bunch of the documents that got burglarized never supposed to be seen by the public were seen by the public because the burglars released them. And there were things in these documents about CoIntelpro nobody knew anything about. And so in the 70s, we got to the bottom of it. We found out exactly what it was. So this is all stuff that we learned after the fact. And of course, here we are now in 2025, and we've continued to learn. And these trials in these cases, JFK in 63, RFK and MLK in 68, and Malcolm X in 65, were all prior to us knowing the documents or having access to the documents that were hidden from us by the CIA and FBI that only got exposed to us in the mid-70s by the church hearings. And so you're counting on these institutions being honest brokers and sharing what they know with the legal system so as to convict the right people. But of course, that didn't happen. That didn't happen, especially in this case. So I call it CoIntel pushes the right button because that's what CoIntelpro did. They were surveilling, they were infiltrating, they were learning about the divisions within the civil rights community in this particular case, and realizing that they could exploit for their own purposes these divisions and manipulate people into doing things, sort of like Sirhan was manipulated through hypnosis and drugs to at least be the diversion in the kitchen pantry at the Ambassador Hotel to make it possible for then Eugene Caesar to shoot RFK in the back of the head. Absent that manipulation or that control through that hypnosis and the drugs, Sirhan never would have done that. But they got control over his behavior. Well, you can also control other people's behavior when you know things because you've infiltrated and you've surveilled. You know who's mad at whom and what the hot buttons are, and you push those buttons and you leak information, and you can exploit people that way, and you can manipulate them to act a certain way in that way as well. So these guys are experts in these psyops. They're just experts in it. I always begin my episodes with a look quickly at the source material where I drew a lot of my information. This being the first episode, I'll go through all of them quickly. In subsequent episodes, I will still include these slides. You can see each time, every time, what sources I'm drawing from, but I probably won't talk about it as much. The Shabbaz Center, pictured top left, is the sort of the library / archives / memorial to Malcolm X. Shabbaz was his Muslim last name. He went by X, and of course he had a different first last name that he was born with. We'll talk about that today. But that is actually the same building he was killed in. That was the Audubon Ballroom in 1965. They've converted it into the Shabbaz Center, and that has become a storehouse of everything related to Malcolm X. And tons of information can be gleaned from the Shabbaz Center. They have a website. Also, the the FBI files that are contained in the National Archives. There's tons of files. We learned as a result of CoIntelpro and those documents that we discovered in the 70s that the FBI had been surveilling Malcolm X since he burst on the scene late 50s, early 60s, and Elijah Muhammad before that, the Nation of Islam before that. So there are a lot of files on the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, and of course, Malcolm X. The Netflix documentary series, Who Killed Malcolm X? Boy, I tell you what, if you want a primer course in all things related to Malcolm X and what led to his assassination and the players involved, check out this series. I think each episode is about 45 minutes. It's extremely valuable. The guy who did the research and really was the driving force behind that documentary is this man. His name is Abdurrahman Muhammad. Of course, that is his Muslim name. And he grew up in that area in Harlem and is very familiar with the mosque itself and the players. Of course, he was familiar with Malcolm X. It was just on a quest. He says he's just driven to find out the truth about Malcolm X. He teaches a course now, as you can see. He's sort of referred to by other experts in this research field as the expert on Malcolm X. And of course, being a Muslim, he had access to people and to places that you and I just wouldn't have access to. And especially being a Black Muslim, he could infiltrate these mosques, these neighborhoods, the eyewitness community, and he could talk directly to them in their own language, so to speak, with the knowledge the Islamic faith, being an Islamic convert himself, with the knowledge that he had, how things work, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, he was just the perfect person to do this research. And I have a lot of respect for the work that he's done because it's confronted him. You know, one of the things he mentions is how he is bothered by the fact how troubled he is by the fact that Muslim brothers who knew the truth about the Malcolm X assassination allowed other Muslim brothers to take the fall and languish in prison even though they knew they were innocent. And just the assassination plot itself to be used by the white man and exploited by the white man to participate in an assassination of another Muslim brother. It bothers him as a Muslim himself to know that those divisions were sown within the Muslim Brotherhood, and it turned brother against brother. And not just for the event itself, but for the aftermath, continuing to this day, the cover-up. And so it's really been, sort of a revelation to him about his Muslim brothers. And so it's kind of a journey worth taking. I would check that series out. Democracy Now! Is a website. Normally, I probably would, 99% of the politics on Democracy Now! I probably don't agree with. I don't know that to be a fact, but just spitballing here. But there is a wealth of information about the Malcolm X assassination on their website where you can go back over prior episodes, and they've devoted entire segments to it. And so I got some information from Democracy Now! And of course, it's up to the date. It's as current as it gets. Dave Garrow, you should recognize his name. He's the guy that is the FBI expert. I used him in the MLK assassination. He has scoured the FBI documents and become sort of an FBI expert. Pictured top left. I have these other pictures. Top right is an actual document with him pointing to information on that document he gleaned, which helped free two falsely accused, falsely convicted people who, were in prison for decades as being part of the plot to kill Malcolm X. It wasn't until he discovered through an examination of these FBI documents that all along the FBI knew that these two men were innocent and that these documents proved it. And so that began the process to go through the legal system and get them exonerated, which begs the question, if they didn't do it, they're the ones who've been paying the price for the assassination, then who did it? And why haven't we pursued, justice after we found out who didn't do it? Why didn't we go trying to find out who did do it? And what we're going to find out as we proceed through these FBI documents is a sobering reality, and that is the FBI always knew who wasn't involved versus who was involved. In fact, they had a description of the guy who fired the fatal shot, but they let him be. They let him go, and let these two guys take the rap instead. So a guy like Dave Garrow becomes very important in the search for the truth, especially when it comes to these two men. Without Dave Garrow, they're still sitting in a prison cell. One of them has passed away by this point, but Claiborne and Carson compiled a lot of the FBI documents. Not every Malcolm X document has been released, but a lot of them have. Claiborne and Carson has sort of gone through, done the heavy lifting for four of us, to compile in one place all the relevant documents pertaining to the Malcolm X assassination. Mannie Parable, he just recently passed away, professor. Well, what a very important book he wrote. It's about Malcolm X's reinvention. That stereotype that I told you in the intro that I had about Malcolm X was based on what I was taught, based on the limited exposure I had to anything related to Malcolm X. He was an apostle of hate. He converted people to his side who also had the predisposition to hate, revenge against the white man. He hated the white man. And it was just inevitable that he would eventually be a victim of his own teaching. And he sort of got what was coming to that. That was a stereotype that I had. And it's based on a very incomplete study of Malcolm X's life. It makes me think, you know, he died when he was 39. So he's a young man. He's just entering middle age. And speaking for myself, probably most of you would agree, you change uh, as you go through life, hopefully. Uh, when you're young, you don't know anything. You're very fervent, you're very intense about the little that you do know. And you have all this passion. A lot of times it's misguided. That's why young people can be manipulated so easily. Uh, a lot of times you operate from an emotional standpoint. You react to things. Um, if something happens to you, you want revenge, you want vengeance, you want to get payback. Uh, and then as you mature and you age and you gain wisdom and you learn more, you start to you get a broader perspective, and maybe you change. I find myself, I look back, I was a writer for my college newspaper, a political editorial writer, and I was a flamethrower. I mean, the stuff I wrote about, I go back and I read it now. It's embarrassing to me. Here I was, young and dumb, didn't know anything, didn't know what I didn't know. But I thought if you asked me, I knew everything. And I had the answers for all the world's problems. And I didn't know anything. I remember when I took my first teaching job, we were having a big teachers meeting, and I committed the cardinal sin. The cardinal sin in a teachers meeting is to raise your hand. Now, those of you that have ever had any experience of teaching know what I mean. You don't raise your hand at a teachers meeting. You try to get through those things. And all their other teachers hate the guy who always raises his hand. Well, I raised my hand. They're asking for ideas. And I was stupid enough to think they really wanted ideas. Nobody wanted ideas. They were just patronizing us. And we were happy to be patronized as long as it meant we could get out for an early lunch. But when I raised my hand, there goes the early lunch. Because then the principal broke us into work groups to discuss my idea. And oh, the daggers that people were shooting me. I learned real quick, keep your mouth shut. Nobody cares what you first year teachers think. We've been teaching for 25 years. I don't care what you think. I've been teaching longer than you are old. That won't work here. So, anyway, I say all that to say we change. We change. We moderate. We become more temperate, hopefully. Sometimes we completely change 180 degrees our positions on things. And wouldn't it be sad if we're all judged by how we were when we were age 35 or 25 or 15? Uh, there's a lot of life ahead. And with Malcolm X, the stereotype that I was taught and that I passed on to many of my students was what he had done with his life up to age 35. And I never learned about his reinvention, about his second conversion. He's got a first conversion we're all aware of when he became a Muslim, joined the Nation of Islam. But there's a second conversion that's very important. It is extremely important to understand Malcolm X. It's interesting to me that when he's a flamethrower and he's called the apostle of hate in his mid-30s, he's being surveilled by the FBI, but he's not considered a threat enough to neutralize, sufficient to neutralize. But when he reinvents himself, he comes back as an apostle of peace. All of a sudden, he's a threat. And that's when he's targeted for assassination. Isn't it interesting that when you're a warmonger, people leave you alone? When JFK was still in the mode of preparing for a Vietnam War, was still in the mode of preparing for a Cuban invasion, he didn't have any issues. When RFK was pro-Vietnam and pro-Cuban invasion, he didn't have any issues. when MLK was yet to talk, when all he was talking about was civil rights, and he wasn't talking about the Vietnam War yet, poor man's war, or the rich man's war. He was being surveilled, but he wasn't targeted for assassination. He wasn't the threat that he became when he started launching the poor man's campaign, poor people's campaign against the Vietnam War. Same thing with Malcolm X. Boy, isn't it interesting that being a peacenik is one of the most dangerous things you can be in America, historically. The warmongers prosper, flourish, get rich, sit on all the boards, get elected to president, get reelected, lauded by the press. The peaceniks get taken out. That's when I started listening to Mannie Parable and accessing some of his work through this book. That's when I got very intrigued all of a sudden in Malcolm X. Because again, having the background information and the background knowledge of all these years of studying the JFK, RFK, MLK stuff, I saw a pattern. I saw something that linked him to these others. And it sort of intrigued me enough to want to go forward. Garrett Felber is a historian, collaborated first with Mannie Parable, and then his second book, Those Who Know Don't Say. Interesting, very interesting look at the Muslim Brotherhood, the so-called Muslim Brotherhood that broke down over the Malcolm X issue and turned Muslim against Muslim, both in the way they regarded Malcolm X, also in the assassination plot, but also in the cover-up, which continues to this day. We'll get into some of the later episodes where I'll give you some information from people that have been interviewed within the last year who knew all this time who the real killer was, who it wasn't, and just continues to say, leave it alone, leave it alone. Don't pick that scab. And these are Muslims, Black Muslims. And so this is a look at the folks within that community who had most motive to want to get to the truth and expose what happened to one of their brothers. But not only did they not do that, they participated in the cover-up. So this goes to what I was telling you earlier, Abdurrahman Muhammad learned, and it really bothers him to this day to know that his people turned on his people, so to speak. All right, Dr. John Fox is an FBI historian, so a lot of information from inside. He's all over YouTube. Always seems to be the guy they call, the go-to guy to talk about the FBI. And he has a lot of one of the things he said that I disagree with. Now, understand that everything he says is coming filtered through the FBI, right? You're getting the FBI perspective. But a lot of what he said about Malcolm X and what happened corroborated the information I was getting from other sources. But then when I asked to offer his opinion about the surveillance and the infiltration, this CoIntelpro program that was designed to go after guys like Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, et cetera, Elijah Muhammad, he says, I think naively, that this wouldn't be allowed to happen today, as if this was something that happened in the past and the FBI has moved past it. I thought, wait a second, we just came through an election cycle in 2016 where it was discovered that the FBI launched a counterintelligence operation against one of the candidates for president based on nothing, based on basically the say-so of the opponent, Hillary Clinton's campaign, and turned that into a special counsel investigation after he was president. And they were surveilling him with bugs in Trump Tower. They sent provocateurs into the White House to interview Mike Flynn, to try to get Mike Flynn to turn on Trump, testify against. I mean, you had the courts involved with these phony warrants, these FISA warrants. It was all directed by the FBI. So for Dr. John Fox to say with a straight face that the FBI doesn't engage in this kind of behavior anymore, it was disingenuous if you're giving him the benefit of the doubt. But anyway, I did get some information from Dr. John Fox, mainly in corroborating information. Interesting movie or documentary series called Four Died Trying. And this is going into what really prompted me to look into this to begin with was there any connective tissue between or amongst these four assassinations? Or were they just isolated, separate incidents? Or was there a pattern? Was there a trend? Was there something overall that was driving these events? Because these four became threats to something. And my goodness, that's to me the most important thing to come out of this study, or all of these studies, is the fact that there is a deep state that believes, and it's unaccountable, it's unelected, but it believes that they are the permanent forces of government, and that the elected politicians come and they go, but they're there before, during, and after. And they don't like their turf being encroached upon by these elected politicians who come in with what they think is a mandate from the American people. And in some cases, it counteracts or disagrees with what this permanent deep state has been doing, is doing, or wants to continue to do. And so that you get this struggle, this tug of war that's going on. And there's all kinds of methods they have to fight back, up to and including assassination, if the threat becomes too grave. And I grew up not learning or understanding any of that. It's eye-opening to finally realize what a president who is elected by the American people is up against when he takes office. Now, if he campaigns on just using an issue that is very important to the deep state, continuous warfare, and he goes along with it, he's not going to have any problems. They're going to grease the skids for him. But if he campaigns for peace, which is one of the common denominators of all four of these, and continuing forward to today, if you want to throw Trump into that mix as well, I mean, that's what he campaigned on. Not forever wars. And if you follow him in the news today, that's what he's trying to do, trying to achieve. And it really helps explain the resistance that he currently faces, that these four faced, up to and including their own death, and the price that they had to pay for peace. If they had succeeded, Trump would be dead today too. He'd be the fifth one in this list. And he wouldn't have all of the same characteristics of the previous four, but he would have one major one, and that's peace. So, Four Died Trying. Interesting documentary series if you want to check it out. My last episode of this series will try to tie up in a bow all the things that these four had in common. And then even up to and including the methods and sources that were used against them and how they were similar as well, which sort of gives you is a telltale signal as to who conducted the assassination, who was behind it. Now, this is not a source because it's necessarily, but if you want to be entertained, here is an ancillary entertainment option. It's called Godfather of Harlem. Phenomenal series. I've been watching it on Hulu. I think it's available on other streaming apps as well. But it's the story of Bumpy Johnson, who's pictured there in the middle, played by Forrest Whitaker. By the way, Forrest Whitaker does a bang up job on this part. And his Harlem, sort of like his little kingdom there that he has. He's got a crime family. He's a mobster, is what he is. And he sells heroin until he doesn't. Then he sells cocaine. I'm not through the entire series yet, but the real interesting, it's I don't find the mob part of it as interesting as I do the relationship between him and Malcolm X, because they share nothing in common. I mean, I shouldn't say nothing. They're both black men in Harlem. They've both been discriminated against. They've both been through tough times. But one is trying to save the black man, and the other is selling the drugs that is poisoning the black man. But yet they're friends. It's a real interesting, complicated relationship. But as far as a timepiece is concerned, if you're going back and studying these events, it puts into, and it's they say in all the episodes right up front, they have this disclaimer about how it's not historically 100% accurate, but it's pretty daggum close. Pretty daggum close. I mean, there are some things like the Italian mob, which Bumpy Johnson's always running into the Italian mob who are trying to take over Harlem because they want their hands on the drug trade. And if you listen to experts and researchers about the mob, the five families in New York, one of the things that you learn is that they did not want to be in the drug business. I listen to Michael Franzese a lot on YouTube, and of course, he was in that life, and then he came out of it. And he recommends Godfather of Harlem, but he adds a caveat saying it's not historically accurate because the Italian mobsters were not in the drug trade. If they were killed. They tried to stay out of the drug trade. And so that's one historical, at least fact, up for dispute. But still, it's fantastic. It draws in it explores the relationship between Bumpy and Malcolm X. It explores the JFK assassination, and you learn anecdotally through conversation amongst these mobsters and other folks in the black community who did it, who they think did it. It explores the relationship between Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. Cassius Clay, he converts into Islam. They give him a Islamic name, and then all the intrigue there related to the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad. Last couple of episodes even brought in William Harvey. Remember Bill Harvey from the Miami station and the JFK assassination research that we did. Evidently, Bill Harvey had contacts in Harlem because there was a Cuban mobster there, and of course, the Cubans were participating with him and all his boys, CIA boys down in Miami, to try to knock off Castro. And this Harlem mobster was helping in that effort. And so, last few episodes, I've been watching William Harvey. It's funny how that guy gets he's involved. He's got his tentacles everywhere. The more you learn about William Harvey, my goodness, somebody important is going to die if William Harvey's involved. In fact, the last episode I just watched, it was a plot to kill Malcolm X and Che Guevara at the same time with a shoulder-fired Stinger missile aimed at the UN building. They were supposed to appear together and give a speech. He was going to shoot the building, blow the building up. My goodness. But so anyway, if you're into entertainment that has something to do with this topic, and it'll draw you in. And I'm getting close to the time period where Malcolm X gets assassinated. All of the episodes I've been watching lately have been dealing with the death threats. And Bumpy Johnson's trying to protect him. And he's becoming increasingly hard to protect because the and the way the show is written, I wondered if they would do this. I thought they might just pin it all on Moss number 7 in Harlem, which is what the government tried to do. But they aren't. They're bringing in the CIA and the FBI, and they're saying the threat's coming out of Washington. This is why Bumpy is having a harder time protecting me. I can protect you from the brothers here in Harlem. I have the network capable of protecting you, but I can't protect you from the government. And I think that's where we're headed. So just wanted to let you know that there's some source material out there you can check out if you're interested. All right, well, today we're going to deal with what I call the first dispensation of Malcolm X, who is not, that's not his birth name. His birth name is Malcolm Little. Basically, in this study of Malcolm X, we're going to be looking at 3 dispensations, 3 time periods, 3 periods of his life that are significant, but you can't judge him by one of those periods or even 2 of them. You got to put all 3 of them together. And we're going to be looking at the first dispensation today, which is a result of his childhood. There's no question Malcolm Little, later Malcolm X, is, especially early in his life, he is a product of his upbringing and what happened to him and to his family when he was a child. This is a picture of his birth certificate. And trying to see if I can, maybe I move my face here. Yeah, anyway, you can see what you see there. So he's born in 1925, and this is the age of apartheid in America. Now, we didn't call it apartheid, we call it segregation. Slavery has ended, but now, especially in the South, you have a dual society. You have the white society and the black society. But that's also true in the North. People don't like to acknowledge that up north, but if you went to a ghetto area of one of the urban cities, that was acknowledged as, that was a very segregated place. And if you wanted to see the American dream and you lived in the urban ghetto, you had to go to the edge of the ghetto and look out past sort of your boundary into white middle class America where the American dream was happening. It was not happening in the urban centers, in the ghettos where Black America lived. So, lest any of you who are, I was this way. I grew up in the North, and I thought the North had clean hands when it came to the issue of African American and civil rights. When it came to slavery, we didn't have slaves. The South had slaves. We didn't have Jim Crow laws. The South had Jim Crow laws. But it was quite a shock to me to find out that we had a very segregated North enforced by banks. For example, if you want to try to get a home loan to get a house, a Black man goes to a bank to get a house in a white community, he's going to be turned down. That's a form of segregation. Same thing with jobs. And so Blacks congregated in the urban areas, in the ghettos, in the North, and in the South, there were just laws that kept the whites and the Blacks apart. So though apartheid was not openly discussed or mentioned, or it wasn't described that way, it's what it was. And in the South, they even took it further, and you had the KKK run around, especially in the 20s. That was the heyday of the KKK. Lynching people, and even, as we got into the 50s and 60s, when Blacks tried to get the right to vote, lynchings were very, very common in the South. So this is the time period that Malcolm Little was born. And that's the climate. That's what's going on in America at the time. So we don't call it apartheid. We call it segregation, but that's what it was. These are Malcolm Little's parents. Now, I said he was a product of his upbringing. His mom and his daddy, though they were not part of any civil rights organization, because in the 20s and 30s, none of those existed, really. There was no Nation of Islam. There was no SCLC, no Black Panthers. But they did resist to the extent that they could, in the ways that they could, the mistreatment, the unequal treatment, the injustices, et cetera, et cetera. Daddy especially refused to play the role of Uncle Tom. That was his example. That's what's flowing through Malcolm Little's veins, is what came from his daddy and his mama. Now, his dad paid the ultimate price, and his son witnessed it. The Black Legion took him out and hung him. And when the branch broke and he didn't die, they put his body on a railroad track, and the train ran over him, cut him in half. And he still wasn't dead. So they shot him. It was like the modern day version of Rasputin. They could kill the guy. Anyway, young Malcolm witnessed that. In the aftermath, Mama tried to claim life insurance. She had a policy. But the life insurance company denied the claim because they said that death had been ruled as suicide. And the only way that they would satisfy the claim is if the court ruled that it wasn't a suicide, that he was actually killed by these white men, the Black Legion. And of course, try in the 1930s to get a court to rule on behalf of a Black plaintiff or defendant and against white defendants. It's not going to happen. So she couldn't get the court to change the ruling, which means the life insurance, and they were going to fulfill the claim. She had no means of supporting the family. The state took the kids away, including young Malcolm. She ends up having a nervous breakdown. The state puts her in an institution, an insane asylum, and she stayed there for decades. By the way, this will be used against Malcolm later X. People will throw in his face constantly that insanity comes from his family or runs in his family. But so if you're young Malcolm, your life has been turned upside down and inside out and backwards by the white man. They killed your dad in the most heinous way possible. They drove your mom crazy. They forced the splintering of your family. You're now living with foster parents or somebody else. And you have very little supervision or family structure left. In Malcolm's case, he ends up becoming a juvenile delinquent, turns really angry. He gets hooked on drugs. He starts burglarizing homes and businesses to support his drug habit. He's sentenced to 8 years in prison for breaking and entering. He had a dangerous weapon with him. So here you see some pictures of him as a young. You can see the anger in his eyes, the set of his jaw, the anger, the hostility, the bitterness. This is the first dispensation of Malcolm Little, and he ends up joining thousands and thousands of other young Black men incarcerated in the American prison system in those days that are like perfect, I don't know, a perfect audience for a new fledgling religious group, a sectarian splinter group called the Nation of Islam, which was led by a former ex-con himself, Elijah Muhammad, came out of the prisons as well. And his message was not one necessarily of redemption, but of revenge. and how the black man was superior to the white man, would eventually triumph over the white man. That was a message Malcolm and these thousands of other young black prisoners in the American prison system were very receptive to. And of course, they are, no pun intended, a captive audience because they're sitting in a prison. And so what happens with Malcolm and thousands of these others is that they convert. This is Elijah Muhammad, who taught that he was Allah's messenger. He was Islamic, and he was Allah's messenger sent to save the black community, mainly young black men. That's his target audience. He said, the kingdom of heaven is nigh. The white demon will soon return to oblivion. The black man, a superior being, will rule the world. So if you're Malcolm Little and you've just watched your daddy be murdered by white men, and the court ruled that he died by suicide, thus your mom can't get the money she's owed from the life insurance policy, resulting in a breakup of the family, the mom being institutionalized, you being sent off to live with foster parents. You've got revenge in your heart, anger and bitterness in your heart. You want some sort of payback against the white man. This is attractive to you. And Muhammad also taught that the Bible was prophecy, not history. You know, you read the Bible, and a lot of the Old Testament is historic in nature. It tells the story of what happened to the nation of Israel and all the people groups around them that either fought against them or helped them, whichever. And it's sort of a tale of, you know, they're in bondage, then they get free. Then they're back in bondage, then they're free again. Then they're back in bondage, then they're free. Back and forth it goes. You get to the New Testament, and they're back in bondage again under the Romans. But there's this talk of this Messiah, this prophecy of a Messiah who's going to come along. Of course, the Jews thought this was a military king or a warrior or a prince or, you know, a warrior king, whatever. And he was going to come in militarily and free them from the Romans and establish them as, and take them to their promised land, so to speak. So it's a mixture of history and prophecy. But because then it goes into the you know, Jesus did come, but he didn't free them in the way that they thought. He actually died on a cross. But it was about a different kind of kingdom, an eternal kingdom, a heaven. So you've got that constant look back, look forward, look back, look forward in the Bible. Well, according to Muhammad, the Bible was all prophecy. It hasn't happened yet. And that his people, the black man, is the superior being that will eventually rule the world. And that he has been sent to, as the messenger of Allah, to proclaim that message. And that the white demon will soon return to oblivion. So this is a very attractive, of course, he has street cred with guys like Malcolm Little and all these thousands of other young black men are sitting in prison cells because he himself was a victim of the American or the white man's legal system. And that's how they viewed it. They were always the victim. So he's got street cred with them because he was in their shoes once. And so you start to see this fledgling movement, and who they're attracting are a lot of these young black men. And we'll get into the Nation of Islam and why the white establishment was so fearful of the Nation of Islam, more fearful of the Nation of Islam than it was the SCLC or anything Malcolm or MLK was doing. Because the people that are being attracted to the Nation of Islam through Elijah Muhammad's message are young black men, predominantly. In other words, folks that can be radicalized, turned into a paramilitary army, so to speak, and have a chip on their shoulder already against the white man and are willing to go fight and would be willing to die for a cause. Whereas on MLK's side, he's teaching nonviolent non-cooperation. You know, they turn the hoses on you, they turn the dogs loose on you, if they turn the billy clubs loose on you, just lay there and take it. Elijah Muhammad and Nation of Islam and the message that he's teaching is not going to teach them to lay there and take it. So that's the difference. So anyway, Malcolm Little converts to the Nation of Islam, and he adopts as his new surname Malcolm X. Now he will be given a Muslim name by Elijah Muhammad, and that name is Shabbaz. But he always went by Malcolm X. And this is his way of repudiating the name given to his family generations ago by slave masters. Right? He said, there's nobody in Africa named Little. That name came from a slave master to my great-great-grandfather, who passed it down to his great-grandfather, passed it down to my great-grandfather, passed it down to my father, passed it down to me. Ultimately, that name was given to me by a white man who was my slave master, or my great-great-grandfather's slave master. And I saw him once in a speech talking about some of the names that these slave masters gave to their black slaves. And they were always derogatory in some sense. He says, for example, Little, that you grow up, if your last name is Little, and whether it's said so in so many words, the connotation of that is that you're small, you're insignificant, you don't matter. Hence the last name Little. That's who you are. You don't count. You're a no count. And it was not lost on him that that was a name given to him by the white man. So he chose the surname X, which is, if you are in the black community in those days, that is something that is historically important to you, because a lot of black people after the Civil War that were recently freed slaves had never had an education. And now they're being forced out. You know, they're no longer working or living on a plantation for a master. They got to go out and negotiate their own work contracts. And they couldn't sign documents. They were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. They'd never learned it. So they would sign documents with X. And that was a legally binding document. And that was the extent of their knowledge when it came to literacy. And so in the black community, the X is a rejection of all things white, all titles, names, affiliations, whatever. X is how I will identify myself going forward. And it's also a way to sort of pay homage to the past and your forefathers. Malcolm was educated. We're going to find out the man is brilliant. He's very intellectual. He didn't choose X because he didn't know how to write his name. This was a purposeful choice on his part. He's rejecting the slave name, all things white that are involved in that slave name, all the connotations, and he's choosing going forward the name X. And of course, this, even though later Elijah Muhammad gives him the surname Shabbaz, he preferred X. And of course, the white media and the white establishment preferred to refer to call him X, because that paints an image of him in the white community as being rebellious. You know, one of the things I learned through this study was body language, or those symbols like X, how important that was in portraying people in a certain way. For example, in the white community, they were used to docile blacks. They were used to a black man who would drop his head, wouldn't make eye contact with a white man, would act very deferential in their presence. um, would never stand up, would actually get out of the way if a white man was approaching. Very, very deferential. And a lot of it was they censored themselves, and they just, that's how they grew up, and that's what they knew. And to avoid confrontation, to avoid problems, that's how they acted. And the white man sort of, uh, there was an appreciation in the white community for blacks who knew their place, so to speak. But then when a black man would come along and look straight in their face and make eye contact, would not bow his head, would not step aside, they would be, the stereotype of that black man would be, well, he's angry, he's violent, he's dangerous. And all it was simple body language. And the X was a way to communicate non-verbally. And this was purposeful on Malcolm's part, because he's going to be wired like his parents. He's not bowing to anybody. And so when he was proud of being referred to as Malcolm X, and the white community happily went along so as to scare the white establishment, the white community as a whole, about Malcolm X, to create a fear of him and what he represented, what his movement would represent, which hasn't happened yet. He's just a new convert, but you can see in his heart how he's wired when he chose that X as his designation, or his designated surname. It didn't take long, because he got released from prison shortly after, and he traveled to Chicago, met with Elijah Muhammad, and he was one of these young, fervent, intense, very passionate individuals. And of course, he now has a platform or a vehicle by which he can all the resentment that he feels towards the white man, all the anger, the bitterness, and hostility that he feels, he now has a vehicle by which he can fight back, or at least it can be used productively for productive purposes rather than a life of crime. Could he not now take all that passion, all that energy, and plow it into something more productive, trying to help his fellow man, his fellow black man? And over time, he begins to see himself prophetically as Paul to Muhammad's Jesus. In other words, Muhammad was the messenger for Allah, and he was the messenger for Muhammad, just like Paul was the apostle for Jesus. In other words, he's viewing himself as sort of Muhammad's right-hand man. And Muhammad started treating him that way as well. Now remember, Muhammad, this is a young fledgling religious movement or organization. And their primary emphasis at this time is to gain converts. And the way Malcolm presented himself in Muhammad's presence when they met was somebody who was so self-assured, forceful. He did not offer disclaimers. He didn't offer excuses. He wasn't shy. He wasn't backward. He wasn't deferential. He was forceful. He was self-assured. There was a strength about him that Muhammad recognized immediately. And something that he recognized that was not very common in African-American men. You'd see it in white men. Had all the advantages, right? But you didn't see it in African Americans. But boy, with Malcolm, it was just coming out of every pore. And you'd say, the question is, where did he get that? Well, to understand Malcolm, even though he's just recently released from prison. He's an ex-con. To understand the way he is portraying himself, you got to go back to his parents. That's where he got it. He got it from his mom and his dad, who both gave something. Daddy gave his life. Mama gave her freedom, gave her sanity, literally, to not give in or not bow to the white man. And so it's why when one of the things you'll learn about Malcolm X as we go forward is that he had very little regard for his own safety. It was frustrating to his security as he got closer and closer to the time in which he's going to be killed. The death threats were just mounting they're coming from everywhere, internally within the Black Muslim movement, but also externally from foreign governments, from his own government, FBI, CIA, NYPD. I mean, they were coming from everywhere. And he basically just acknowledged the fact he wasn't going to live a long life, and he didn't really care. He said, I'm not going to hide. And that can be viewed two ways. It can be viewed as, well, he was just careless. Or it can be viewed as he's a chip off the old block. He just watched his parents give everything. That's who he is. And he believes so deeply in this cause that that's not that he had a death wish, but he wasn't afraid, just like his daddy wasn't afraid. And it was almost like the anger that he had was so much stronger than any fear that he could have had. And it was extremely frustrating to his security, his bodyguards trying to keep him safe. Because first of all, he was out and about. He was all over the country. He was all over the world. And so from a security standpoint, it was almost impossible, logistically speaking, to protect him. And then, but it can be done if the protectee is careful, is considerate of the security demands. But he wasn't. He said, I'm probably not going to live a long life anyway. I'm not going to live in fear. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to run. And I think he got a lot of that from his parents. So anyway, he's converted. He's changed his name. He meets Muhammad. Muhammad is very impressed. And he begins assigning Malcolm to travel the country and preach. This is another thing that they learned pretty quickly about Malcolm, is that he is an extraordinary speaker. I hate to make this comparison because he's bursting onto the scene from nowhere. I mean, he's out of a prison, basically. It reminds me very much of Adolf Hitler and how he bursts on the scene. He also comes out of a jail cell, but before that, from Austria, this little tiny country, he helped Germany in World War I and ended up in a hospital because he was injured in an attack, and war ends while he's in the hospital. He joins a movement in Germany in the aftermath of World War I and discovers that he has a penchant for speaking. And he rises through the ranks because of his speaking abilities. And he gets thrown in jail after a failed coup. And his fame just continues to grow when he gets out of jail. Well, the rest is history. But a lot of it is because he can speak and rally the spirits of the German people, which were pretty downtrodden at that point. And of course, he always had a boogeyman, right? It was the socialists, it was the Jews. And that's how he would get the people, these downtrodden people full of spit and vinegar, to want revenge again for all their bad circumstances against these boogeymen, these socialists, and these Jews, and whomever else, communists. Malcolm X, too, had a boogeyman. He was full of this energy, this rage, this anger, this hostility. His boogeyman was the white man. And when he traveled, he spoke with force and energy, which appealed to these other young black men who were just recently released from prison or were still in prison and hearing his message. And he was so strong and forceful that he begins attracting converts to the Nation of Islam in such numbers. Elijah Muhammad cannot dispute the fact that this guy has something special about him. And so he pretty quickly says, I want you to go and travel the country on behalf of the Nation of Islam. And the payoff is immediate. I mean, thousands start flocking into the Nation of Islam, becoming converts to Islam. And as time goes by, the relationship between Muhammad and Malcolm X turns into like a father-son relationship, a savior convert relation, or savior-son. And Malcolm X was just extremely deferential to the man he considered to be his father in place of his father, his savior, saving him from this life of crime, now giving him this opportunity, this platform to do something productive with his life. And it's pretty typical to go to an event where Malcolm X was the first speaker introducing Elijah Muhammad. And as an introduction, he would say, quote, "We have come to hear and see the greatest and the wisest and most fearless black man in America today." Those are some pretty heady words, but that's how Malcolm X viewed Elijah Muhammad. And in the early days, he deflected any glory that came to himself and gave it to Elijah Muhammad. And he was careful to do that. And it was reciprocated. Elijah Muhammad took Malcolm X under his wing, saw him as his most important convert to that point, and somebody who could be groomed into a possible successor. Elijah Muhammad was much older than Malcolm X, and so the father-son relationship made sense, the savior-son relationship. But there's going to come a time when Elijah Muhammad's got to pass the baton. He's looking for someone who can take the Nation of Islam to the next level, or into the next generation. And he thought it might be his kids, but his actions speak to a decision that he made internally that it was actually Malcolm X. He gave him certain perks that he didn't give anybody else. He had ministers spread across the country. Malcolm was just one of those ministers. He was the only one allowed to drive Elijah Muhammad's car around when he would come visit, chauffeur him around town. He gave him money. He paid for his wife, Betty, to go to nursing school. If you were one of Elijah Muhammad's own children, you recognized pretty quickly that your father had an affinity for this Malcolm X guy who wasn't even in the family, so to speak, that exceeded even the affinity he had for his own kids. They didn't get the perks he got. He starts referring to Malcolm as his seventh son. So the relationship, there was no separation between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. They were very tight early on. Of course, that's going to cause seeds of resentment to begin to spring up within Elijah Muhammad's own family. His own children looked at Malcolm X with envy, jealousy, because he had what they didn't. He was articulate, he was brilliant, he was intellectual. They had all the benefits that Malcolm didn't have growing up, and yet Malcolm was blessed supernaturally with things that they could never attain. It's interesting. You don't normally hear people talk about an ex-con as being intellectual. He might be articulate, he might be smart, brilliant, whatever. But intellectual, that's a different ballgame. But that's how folks who knew Malcolm X in these days described him. He was intellectual. He's a deep thinker. And on top of that, he was just a tremendous speaker. So that is the introduction to this study that we're going to undertake regarding Malcolm X. I wanted to just introduce you to his background and both with respect to his upbringing, what happened to him as a child, but then his conversion experience into the Nation of Islam and his relationship with the prophet Elijah Muhammad and how tight they were. This is part of the first dispensation of Malcolm X. He's going to channel the anger. He grows up in a home or in a situation which produces a very angry young man. And initially, he channels it into an unproductive pursuit, which is crime. Then he's converted. And what we're going to find out in episode 2 is that in this conversion experience where he learns he can take that anger, that same hostility, he doesn't have to turn the other cheek. He doesn't have to forgive. He doesn't have to forget. He can carry that forward, but channel it into something productive. But it's all still going to be driven by anger and hatred and violence. Instead of acting out with anger and hostility and violence, he's talking out with anger and hostility and violence. And he's recruiting converts who feel the same way. And it's creating a movement. But it's all still driven by the anger, the hostility, the unforgiveness, the bitterness, the violence, etc. And so the first dispensation is when he is angry as a result of what happened to him as a child, and he uses it to commit crimes. The second dispensation, which we just started today and we'll get into more in episode 2, is when he channels that after his conversion experience into creating a movement. And that is those first 2 dispensations, which the common thread there is anger, hostility, violence. That is what most people know about Malcolm X. They know nothing about the third dispensation, the third version, the reinvented Malcolm X, which happens later in life, which is when, by the way, he's targeted for assassination. So in order to understand dispensation 3, we have to first lay the groundwork and explain dispensations 1 and 2, which make dispensation 3 so important, so impactful. So we'll get to that. We'll work our way through it methodically. So that's episode 1. I hope you enjoyed that. Until next time, I hope everybody has a very blessed day. Thank you.